Tomorrow, September 16th, 2025, Anchorage will celebrate 50 years as a unified municipality. In honor of that anniversary, I am re-releasing an episode from last year with Charter Commission member Jane Angvik. This episode is almost exclusively about the Charter Commission. I have another episode with Jane about her life, which you can find a link to in the show notes. I have also interviewed the other two living members of the Anchorage Charter Commission, Joe Josephson and Lisa Parker. You can find links to their episodes in the show notes as well. Enjoy this episode, and happy 50th birthday to the municipality of Anchorage.
One of the huge conflicts that occurred that was the tipping point for the unification effort was that a hotel on Northern Lights caught on fire. And the city fire department came, but the fire was on the south side of the street. And so the borough fire people were trying to fight it, and the city fire people would not engage in a fire in a hotel where 3 people died.
Because it was out of their jurisdiction.
They just watched it. And the people said, this is insane.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today is our second episode with Anchorage Charter Commission member Jane Angvik. Shortly after moving to Anchorage in 1973, she found herself running for her first elected office, which was on the Anchorage Charter Commission. What she had learned during her time working for the Anchorage Borough Planning Department was that the City of Anchorage and the Borough of Anchorage hated each other. They couldn't stop suing each other, and the state of Alaska had grown weary of the drama. And as you heard in the opening, lives were lost due to this ridiculous conflict. This is Jane Angvik's recollections of her time serving on that Charter Commission in 1975. I begin this episode by playing a couple of minutes from the last episode to provide some context. The full interview that we did was 2.5 hours long at Jane's kitchen table. You'll hear her go and grab her original copy of the charter at one point. We pick up after Jane has lost her job with the city of Minneapolis and has come to visit her sister Peggy, who was working as a middle school teacher in the Anchorage School District.
And I came to visit, and I hadn't been to Alaska before. And you had mountains and you had ocean. And so I thought it was fabulous. And I applied for a job in Anchorage with the Greater Anchorage Area Borough Planning Department. And lo and behold, they said I could have that job. And so I went back to Minnesota and drove my car up to come and live in Anchorage, Alaska in the summer of 1973 and went to work for the Greater Anchorage Area Borough.
Jack Roderick?
Jack Roderick was the mayor. My first friend in Alaska was Susan Ruddy, who was working for Jack in the mayor's office. And she came down to the planning department because she'd heard that they'd hired a woman planner. And there I was, and we became friends forever. Susan and I at the borough had written a grant to the Alaska Humanities Forum. And what we wanted to do was create an opportunity for Anchorage to think more broadly about what kind of a future we want in the community. And my job was working on the comprehensive plan at the time. And one of the things from Minneapolis Model Cities program that I had learned was we got to go out to neighborhoods and talk to people about what they think about. And so we have to hold community meetings. And I took Jack Roderick and I said, Jack, they have to see the mayor. They have to see the leader of the pack in order to believe that this is real. And so assembly meetings were on Tuesday nights. So on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday night, we had community meetings. And that is the way we did the fall and the winter of 73 and 74.
That's the basis for our community council system.
Yes, in fact, that was also the development of the community councils at the same time. So I got a job for the Greater Anchorage Area Borough, and then I met Susan Ruddy, and then the two of us wrote a grant to the Alaska Humanities Forum for the purposes of holding community think tanks. Only it wasn't going to be like meeting in the school cafeteria. We were going to get outside experts to come to Alaska and talk about different ways of doing things in governance. We held 4 of those over the course of the winter, One was a community group of smart people in California who had just developed something called the California Tomorrow Plan for the entire state of California, having to do with governance structures. We're not doing planning for the city. It was, how do we bring people together to make decisions when you've got counties and cities and neighborhoods in conflict? How do you do that in such a manner that you can do it with less conflict and seeking more cooperation? And so that group was particularly spectacular. And there were 500 people who would come, and they didn't have to pay. Or they would come and they would engage, and they would break into small groups, and they would come back with recommendations at the end of the day about what Anchorage could do with the same kinds of information. And it was thrilling and exciting. And Jack and the Planning and Zoning Commission and assembly members would come and they go, this is kind of interesting. These people in Anchorage don't like each other. And lo and behold, here they are talking cooperatively. That's a pretty good thing. And so we did that several times.
I vaguely recall a story that
Vic Fisher, who had met you when you were holding all of those community meetings, he'd come down from Fairbanks and been to one and really liked it. And so apparently y'all were at a hotel or something, and he
walked around the room collecting money for you to run for the Charter Commission.
That's correct.
What was that story?
Probably 5 months later, he had come back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and we were sitting in the Hilton in the bar, and I had decided to run for the Charter Commission. Oh, and by that time I had left working for the borough, and I was working for AFN, and I had watched the conflict between the city and the borough was significant, and concluded that we needed to unify these two governments. And so the charter was designed to try to bring the former City of Anchorage and the former Greater Anchorage Borough together into one government. And at the time, the boundary was Northern Lights. Northern Lights was the boundary between the city and the uncharted Greater Anchorage area borough all the way to Girdwood or all the way to Eagle River.
Right.
So anyway, I decided I was wanting to do that. And he said, I can help you. And I said, you live in Fairbanks. And he said, let's see. So he had previously been the first city planner of Anchorage, and he knew a whole bunch of people and had lived here for many years. So we sat in the bar at the Hilton Hotel, and he walked from table to table to table, introducing me to Cliff Grove Sr. and to engineer Charlie Trick, and Ed Crittenden, who was a preeminent architect, who are all his friends, and said, she's running for the Charter Commission, and it's good to have a younger person on the Charter Commission instead of a bunch of old white men. So I think you should invest in her campaign right now. And they were like writing me checks for $100 to run for the Charter Commission. And I went, what do I owe people for that? I'm not too sure. I didn't know very much about politics at the time in terms of campaign contributions as an investment in the government you seek as opposed to trying to buy off a politician. And so I was not sure, though, what anybody expected in return, other than I said, if I'm elected, I'll certainly attend every meeting and participate to the fullest extent that I can. That's the best I can do for you about this, in case you think this is something else I can do. And they all looking at me like I was crazy, because I was crazy. Anyway.
For those of us who only lived in a unified Anchorage, it's hard to understand what it's like to have a city council and a borough assembly, I think is the way it was. The closest place that we see is the Matsu Borough Assembly, and Wasilla has a city council and Palmer has a city council. And
there's a Matsu Borough.
Correct.
Over all of it.
And I've often asked, because I'll ask, we have folks in the legislature from the Matsu, and I'll say, who's in charge? Is the borough assembly rule over the city council, or the city council in charge of Wasilla? Who's in charge of what? And I guess that was the type of conflict you guys were having here, is who was in charge of what?
Yes, that was correct. And in the history of downtown Anchorage, the city proper was populated from 1915 forward, and outside of The Northern Lights was
Right.
were
Talking-
homesteads.
Basically, the city was what we have today is downtown, Bootleggers Cove, South Addition, those neighborhoods that are just really in the core of
Right.
the downtown area.
So it'd be the ocean to I think it went not quite to Muldoon, going east, probably closer to maybe Lake Otis, and south to Northern Lights and to
But south of Northern Lights was not Anchorage City.
it was the unknown wilderness, which was regarded as other.
Borough.
And it was managed by the borough. And the borough's responsibilities, they had responsibility for area-wide city planning, area-wide taxation, and area-wide education. So schools, taxes, and planning is what they were in charge of. And they had the responsibility for the development of water and sewer to support the people who were living outside of this service area, which was the city, that was already served by sewer and water. And remember that the people had large lots, and so many people were on wells and septic tanks, so didn't want anything to do with water and sewer from the city or anybody else.
And just for clarity, we're also talking about Eagle River, Peters Creek, Chugiak. They're part of the borough as well.
They are, and they were, and they had been incorporated into the borough. And the people in Eagle River, Chugiak, and Peters Creek did not like it. And so they had engaged in a secession from the borough. And when we started the effort of the Charter Commission, they had seceded. They were gone, and they were their own government. And subsequently, the state tried to persuade them to come back into the borough because the rule in the state government is contiguous. And so in the end, they sued. They said that they didn't want to be part, and they lost that suit, and that forced in the middle of the Charter Commission process, they were forced to come back into the borough, which they hated. I did get elected to the Charter Commission. We met twice a week for months, and we held public hearings all over the community because I was on it, and that's what we do, and talked to people about what were the things that they were most concerned about and what we could do about it. And then we went out to Eagle River to hold a public hearing, and they were furious, and they sued us. We were all served with papers personally at the meeting. Okay, here, Jane Angvik, we're suing you for making us do this. And we were individually and as a group sued by them to say we don't want to come. And then the court subsequently said, you have to do it. You really have to be part of Anchorage.
Wow. That's such great context. It just shows that the way it looks today, it's been that way for 50 years. Actually, and I know it's been longer. I interviewed a man who'd grown up in Peters Creek, and he had said that all of his parents' friends, he didn't know a single person who voted for statehood. They wanted to stay out of the state.
Nothing to do with you people. We're by ourselves. They often came to public meetings, and they had guns. They would just have a gun, and they put it on the podium, they slam it down and go, now, Missy, let me tell you what I think. And I go, okay, you got my full attention. All right, put your gun down. Okay, thank you. And it was more like an exclamation point than a threat. It was just...
What was the makeup of the Charter Commission? How many people and where were they from?
11 people. 3 were area-wide and equal numbers. So
4 from the city and
4 from the city,
borough.
4 from the borough.
And you were from the borough?
Yes.
That's interesting. I don't think people knew that. So you lived in Sand Lake.
At the time.
Which was considered out of Anchorage, like not part of the city.
How they spoke of it was inside the city or outside the city.
Mm-hmm. So you were outside the city.
I was outside the city. And
so you were one of the 4 from outside the city.
And Lisa Parker was 21 and I was 24. And so we were absolutely the babies, the youngest. And we had equal numbers of men and women. We had five women and 6 men. And we had equal distribution of people who were politically conservative and people who were more politically liberal.
I saw your campaign flyer for when you ran for the Charter Commission, and I'm curious about that as well. They had the Borough Assembly and they had the City Council, and this was the separate committee of people. Were there any members of the Assembly or the City Council on the Charter Commission?
Yes.
Did you do both?
Yes.
But
yes.
you had to run separately.
Yes. An important consideration of what was going on at the time is the City Council sent 5 of their City Council members to serve on the Borough Assembly. They chose those people.
Oh.
And so the composition of the Anchorage Assembly was 5 people from the City Council would come and sit on the Borough Assembly, and the other 6 people on the Assembly were elected. And
Got it.
So
Anchorage was controlling the Borough Assembly.
So the city government's interest in what happened at the borough was significant. And from the perspective of Jack Roderick, who is the mayor of the borough, he said it was an impossible situation because they would show up with 5 votes on every issue, and simply all they had to do was peel off one more person, and they kept screwing up the efforts of the borough to be able to conduct its business. And particularly challenging was the planning stuff was regarded as a complete intrusion into the life of people who, while there were rules within the city, there was not building inspectors who actually reviewed stuff and reviewed plans, and they didn't like the fact that they had to say, "Captain, may I build a building and build a house?"
A light bulb just went off in my head. So Jack Roderick was the borough mayor.
You understand.
Who was the city mayor?
George Sullivan.
George Sullivan. And what was the relationship like between the borough mayor and the city mayor?
I think, first of all, they were cordial. And then the other thing that's really different is it was a council management form of government for the city. That means that the city council hired a city manager, and that was the chief executive officer, and that the city council managed the city manager. So it's a council management form of government as opposed to the structure of government of the borough was a strong mayor form of government, which meant that the mayor was the chief executive.
So George Sullivan.
He was a ceremonial mayor.
Ceremonial.
He was a member of the city council.
Oh, I got it.
Who was selected as the mayor. And he was the ceremonial representative for the, but the power of what was going to happen in the city was
the
the
city
council decided, and the manager would do their bidding. And they could hire and fire the manager at will. And in the borough, it was a strong mayor form of government where the mayor was the chief executive officer and hired people to do stuff.
So
and
what we have now
the assembly is the
borough structure.
They had the legislative body was the assembly. So the city council people were quite accustomed to running their government. And the borough assembly people were quite accustomed to legislating, different than being in charge of the operations. And so on Monday night, they would sue the Anchorage borough over issues associated with land use planning or over issues associated with unreasonable taxation, or the borough also had responsibility for roads that would go into town. So, for example, one of the huge conflicts that occurred that was the tipping point for the unification effort was that a hotel on Northern Lights caught on fire. And the city fire department came, but the fire was on the south side of the street. And so the borough fire people were trying to fight it, and the city fire people would not engage in a fire in a hotel where 3 people died.
Because it was out of their jurisdiction. They just watched it.
They just watched it. And that was not doing very well by the citizens who live here by having 2 governments with attitude. And so the fire on the Northern Lights Hotel was one of the tipping points you have where the people said, this is insane. We got to create a way where there's no magic line that says, I don't have to help somebody on the other side of the line when their house is on fire. Or I don't have to help somebody on this side of the land if they've got a problem. Because it was a tiny little population. It was 100,000 people, maybe. It was tiny relative to today. So that was one example of things that not going well. The second example had to do with talking to the Alaska legislature. As you might imagine, you're getting one set of directives from the city and another set of directives from the borough about what you need to do if you actually had a capital budget. No, we really need the sewer system, and they're going, the hell with their sewer system. What we need is a ballpark or whatever. I'm just saying that, or what we really need is a new fire department or a new building or a new fire truck or something like that. And so there was discord, which resulted in legislators being confounded, or legislators would have, my district is in the borough, so I'm saying we're going to do this, and your district is inside the city, and you're saying, no, this is the priority for Anchorage. And the people from the rest of the state are going, screw these guys. They don't even know what they want. And so I'm just saying to you that it was a chaotic situation.
And how did you guys write the charter itself? We know when we talk about writing the Constitution, at the Constitutional Convention, they looked at other states' constitutions. They took pieces from here and there. How did you guys go about writing the actual charter?
We also did the same thing, which is we looked at other charters that have been written in other jurisdictions, many in Alaska. And there had been a previous effort to write the charter, a unification charter. So we looked at that one extensively. And what we did was use the first one as the first draft. And then what do we do with it? Where we articulate what are the services?
Who had written the first one? Or when was the first charter commission that didn't pass, I guess?
2 years earlier.
Okay.
3 years earlier. And two people who served in the charter had served on the first one. And some of the people who had served on the first one came to meetings regularly just to say what had happened. We had hired a wonderful guy named Rich Garrett, was the lawyer who had previously worked for the state and had actually helped with the implementation of the Constitution. And he and a couple of other lawyers were helping with the drafts and the consideration. And then the composition of the Charter Commission was equally divided between people who resided within the city boundaries and people who resided outside the city boundaries. But there were not big conflicts. There were conversations about how to do things. And all of the people were supportive of unifying the two governments. There are lots of citizens who did not want to do that, who would come and talk to us. And so they were just saying, stop, don't do it, go away. We like it the way it is. And my observation was that Frank Reed was our chairperson, and he was a highly regarded statesman. He's a banker, and he was probably the most respected person in the community who was serving on the Charter Commission. And he was our chair, and he was our Bill Egan, meaning he was a person who could resolve to everybody go outside, walk around, come on back, we got to break this up so we're not having conflict. And he was simply wonderful in refereeing, but there were not so many conflicts as there was a lot of work to be done. And there was a group of women, Arla Sturgielewski and
League of Women Voters people. And yeah, I think it's lovely. The League of Women Voters
had been very important in Anchorage in providing people who were mostly at home taking care of kids with the opportunity to learn about government. And they were really good at having study committees. And so in the 50s and the 60s, they were people who were really going to study an issue and then make recommendations to the community about those things. And they were respected for that effort. And they weren't partisan. They were the League of Women Voters, and with that comes this mantle of objectivity and industriousness. And so Arliss had been a leader of the League of Women Voters, and so from her perspective, she taught me many things. When the first one was always volunteer to write the minutes. And I said, why? Women always get caught being the secretaries. And she said, you are the person who is recording your version of what happened historically in that meeting. And I said, are you suggesting that the minutes might not necessarily reflect what really happened? And she said, I'm saying the tone and the texture is the responsibility of the secretary, and there's value in that. So she
understood
clear
value.
That there was great value in being able to do that work. And the second thing she said is, always volunteer to write the agenda. You get to determine what the subject is going to be. So you're saying, what is the future going to be? And you're saying, what is the past? You're in charge of making sure that the tone and the texture of what we're going to do and what we're going to do next is a piece of it. And she said most people regard that as a clerical job that should appropriately go to a woman, and we will happily do it. And so it was really an interesting thing. So she and Sherry Holmes, who was also a member of the League of Women Voters, and Lisa Parker, who was then a student at the university, and sometimes me, not as often. They would do it.
Oh, and Bill Sheffield was on the...
Bill Sheffield served on the Charter Commission, as did
Joe Josephson.
And Joe, I'm just saying, people who had day jobs had a lot of other things to do. Bill Sheffield would reflect on it and say, they asked me to run for this thing, and it won't take any time at all. He said, they met 3 times a week. These people are crazy. He just went on and on. And he said, and all they wanted to talk about was city government. And I didn't find it as interesting a topic as they did.
That's so funny. Speaking of day jobs, were you working for the Alaska Federation of Natives at that time?
Yes, I was.
And was that a busy day job?
It's a regular job. Yeah. And it would also be traveling. So I was sometimes part of the women's group who was doing all the work, and sometimes I was with the people who had day jobs who couldn't meet at 2 p.m. because we had stuff we had to do. There was a time in Anchorage where there were a lot of 7 a.m. meetings and a lot of 5:30 meetings. And I didn't have a family at the time, so I was pretty flexible about those kinds of things as well. But it was Sherry Holmes and Arliss and Lisa Parker were a ferocious, hardworking group of women. What we were doing was taking something that existed, and then we would draft something either like it or different. And that would come back as a proposal. Everybody had a chance to review it, and then we would vote on it at a set meeting so that everybody would know when we were actually making the decision on that particular phase of it. We also received a lot of information from the finance people of both the city government and the borough government, and the finance officers of those organizations, and what their constraints and opportunities were associated with management of the money. Very important. And then we devoted an enormous amount of time and energy to making sure that we didn't write anything that made it impossible for those two systems to try to figure out how to work together. The process, by the way, of implementing the charter was really hard. And the heroes and heroines of that effort deserve gold stars.
I was going to ask about that. Dissolving the city council, dissolving the borough assembly, making a new one, deciding where to meet, deciding how...
That was easy compared to taking the public works office of the borough and the public works office of the city, who hated each other,
and putting them all in the same building.
And George Sullivan deserves high praise and high accolades for having figured this out. And He was a city guy. But his job on day one was to create a government out of what they had been. And he figured out that if he made them physically sit in the same room, but that your day job is now to come and be in this office with these guys. Mm-hmm. And those are the guys who you don't like because they're the city and you're the borough. And share lunch and share the coffee pot and share the call of the public and find out if you're talking to the public in the same voice or not. And he did that with every government structure. George viscerally did this from his gut. He knew people. He was an astonishing people person. The other savior of the process of combining those governments was Eleanor Andrews. And Eleanor was the person who had the responsibility for merging 8 or 10 different wage structures and unions that had completely different job descriptions, completely different remuneration structures, and create a process that was going to recognize whatever the obligations of the government's organizations had been to those employees with respect to retirement and what the contractual obligation is. And they were different also, by the way, so that creating a structure that was two-tiered that would allow that to get worked out was really challenging. And Eleanor worked with all the unions, all the organizations who had employees with really perturbed employees. It was very challenging. And so I just have to say the heroes were the people who implemented the merger.
Were we the first borough and city to merge in Alaska?
No.
Was Juneau before us?
Yes. Yes. Juneau had done it. And we spent time with them too. They had to go through that process. So writing it was, you said, the draft that we worked with was basically the charter that had been prepared by the previous Charter Commission, which had been influenced by the Juneau experience and had done a lot of research on structures of government. Probably the big decisions, significant decisions that were going to be imprimaturs of the organization was what was the form of government going to be? And that was not prescribed.
And you guys decided on a strong mayor.
By one vote.
One vote. What'd you vote for?
I voted for the strong mayor form of government. But the question was, shall we approve?
Shall we have a strong council?
And there were 5 votes. It was 5-5. One person was missing.
And it failed because someone was missing.
Yes. And that was Dick Fisher, who was missing at that meeting. But that was the only time that it was people who lived in the city versus people who didn't live in the city.
Interesting. Did you get paid to be on the Charter Commission?
First of all, I don't remember.
I asked you, it sounds like it was a lot of work.
And I think it might have been $50 a meeting if we got paid.
Gotcha. And then it went to a vote of the people? And was it close?
No.
It was just decisive.
Yes.
Decisively for unification.
It was decisive. And we really worked hard on
selling it
mostly on the basis it's a duplication of services and a duplication of efforts, and it fragments. And the pictures of the burning hotel were very significant in the emotional tug of why we can't do that again.
Right.
And then the other part is there are 2 things that were really important that were part of the charter in order to try to persuade people to vote for it. Issue number 1 is the argument was that the people who had lived inside the city boundaries had been paying for government for 50 years at that point, and there needed to be some recognition that they'd already paid for all of this infrastructure and that they didn't want to pay for all the infrastructure for the new people and the new government. And so the tax structure was set so that for the first 5 years should it pass that for the first 5 years of the unified government, there would be a tax cut
holiday for
rebate
inside,
from,
yeah.
you didn't have to pay and get it back. You
Right.
just, your tax level was lower in recognition of the 50 years that you people have been paying taxes for life. And then on the outside, they didn't want no government shoved down their throats. And so they don't like government, and they were afraid that this was going to be a proliferation of everybody having to have all the services that they have and pay for downtown.
Right.
And they didn't want to do that. And so the list of services, I should probably look at it, but it was limited. And the service area concept is the issue that is for the people who are outside the city. And that basically means you must pay for education, you must pay for city planning, and you must pay for some level of public safety. That doesn't mean full tilt boogie police services as much as the 911 telephone or something like that says it. So, and then if you live in what is the area that is outside the former city, you have the opportunity to choose what services you seek, and that you have the opportunity to organize your neighborhood or your subdivision or your part of the area to say, we've got enough people here now, so we really need road service area, and we're willing to pay for it. Or we have enough people here now, so we really are willing to pay for parks and recreation, and we're willing to pay for the expansion of the sewer system to us, because we, the people who live in this neighborhood, seek additional services, and we are willing to pay for them. And the service area concept stood in as the primary method for increasing services in what used to be the outer parts of the community for 10, 15 years, I think. And the last straw that made some people unhappy was people out in the hillside were not paying for police services. Mm-hmm. And that's because they didn't want to pay for police services. And they had troopers paid for by the state of Alaska who took care of them on the hillside. And increasingly, the population was growing and growing, and the value of what was up there was increasing, and they still weren't paying for police services. And so the state legislature was saying, this is crazy. The citizens of Alaska are paying for the services for people on the hillside, so we have to compel those people to create a service area for police services and pay for it. And in the end, they were forced to do so by the state legislature over their objections. That's the only element that was dealt with in that manner, because people didn't want to pay for their police services. And the rest of the legislators in the state of Alaska were saying, well, we don't want to pay for troopers to be on the hillside when we need them in Bethel and other places.
Right.
But those two aspects, a tax holiday for the people in the city for 5 years, and the service area concept in our outlying area, were critical to the consideration of the people who were going to have to vote for the organized government, and they're going to have to vote for the charter.
Last question about the charter. We mentioned it earlier when you were doing your sort of town halls where you're bringing in guest speakers, as that being the birthplace for the idea of community councils. But can you talk a little bit about the decision to include community councils in the charter and what the purpose of the community councils were and how that vision has unfolded over the last 40 years?
It was not controversial, and people were very willing to include community councils because it had started and it was useful for people to be able to have the opportunity to get a point of view other than the 5 people who came to the public hearing on something or other. And it strengthened the opportunities for a neighborhood to be able to be represented where everybody didn't have to go there on Tuesday night and testify. And community councils didn't have very much power and so the people who thought, whatever it is, it's like a mosquito, I don't have to worry about it, it's just a little something or other those do-gooders want to have. And so they were not very powerful at the time. And I believe that on very important land use decisions in particular, And we were still zoning. We were literally for the first time zoning land in Anchorage when I served on the assembly in the early 80s. We were still zoning the hillside. We were still zoning Eagle River. We were still zoning all the way down to Girdwood. And those were large lot parcels that didn't want to be zoned by anybody. And all we were doing was making sure that the zoning provided a density that whatever the characteristics of that piece was could be accommodated. And if you had a low-lying area, a wetlands area in your thing, we understood that at the time there was probably going to be very little development. Subsequently, they learned how to drain the swamp and build on it.
I think we're in a low-lying area right now.
You're right. Anyway, I'm just saying that it used to be a consideration that if it was a swamp, it wasn't going to be developed.
Right. So the community councils with these new areas that are being zoned, would you create a new community council for that area so that those folks could offer feedback about what they wanted? Or
ultimately, there was a creation of new councils as population grew, and population ended up in places that hadn't previously been populated. In the end, what we ended up with was every piece of land within the municipal government is included in somebody's community council. And we didn't initially create that. We created a process that said you can create a community council and you get to draw the boundaries of it.
Jane Angvik, thank you so much for being on the show today.
I was delighted to be here.
For the rest of Jane Angvik's life story, go back and listen to last week's episode, which covers her childhood in Minnesota all the way to her administering the oath of office to Anchorage Mayor Suzanne LaFrance 2 weeks ago. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklive.gov or call 907-269-0123.